How's it going, guys? Chris from Green Bench Brewing Company here again. Welcome back. We are on Module 6, Fermentation Technologies. This slide is fermentation control and monitoring. It's a little long, so bear with me. Let's bounce into it. All right, so we're going to talk about cylindroconical cooling systems, traditional fermenter cooling systems, foeder cooling systems, which I guess I kind of talked about a little bit in the last slide, glycol systems, and fermentation monitoring. Okay, cylindroconical cooling systems. Today's fabricated tanks usually come with a standard option jacketed or single walled tank. So you'll either have it jacketed with glycol, so there's a wall jacket for the glycol to run through, insulation, and another wall, which I guess I talked about that in the last slide as well, or just a single wall, where there's no jackets, there's no glycol, it's just a tank with a wall that's there. Jacket tanks use a glycol solution to maintain the fermentation temperature. Single-wall tanks need to be housed in a conditioned space in order to maintain fermentation temperature. So if you're single-wall, there's no jackets, there's no glycol running on it. You have to put it into essentially a climate-controlled space, so it has to be at the temperature of the environment. This is less efficient at higher volumes. The bigger the batches of beer, the harder it is to keep the entire batch cool because you have this thermal mass and fermentation is very hot. It creates a lot of energy, creates a lot of heat. So the larger the volume, the harder it is to control a single volume or single walled tank as far as temperature goes. Traditional fermentation cooling systems. So, like single-walled systems, traditional fermenters usually use the atmospheric temperature for cooling itself. Brewers that use traditional open fermentation techniques usually will climate control the room that houses the fermenter. Often the room is under positive pressure. For example, the guys at Wicked Weed up in Asheville have an open fermenter that they do open fermented farmhouse ales. So these saisons are in a room that has positive pressure, and the room itself is climate controlled, so they can keep the temperature wherever they want. Foeder cooling systems. Most breweries use the atmospheric temperature to regulate their oak fermentation, often climate controlling the room itself that houses the foeder. There are obviously options as well, though, for cooling coils that can be installed that line the inside wall of the foeder. Glycol can be used and run through the cooling coils to regulate the temperature of the foeder itself. Glycol systems. So, glycol units are commonly used by breweries to maintain the temperature of all their fermenters, conditioning tanks, cold liquor tanks, and bright tanks. So glycol units are essentially refrigeration units. They use a mixture of food-grade propylene glycol and water that run around the tanks through their jackets or the cooling coils in foeder's case in order to cool the liquid in the tanks. So, glycol units consist of a few things. There's the reservoir for the tank that holds the glycol itself. There's the recirculation pump to maintain the reservoir temperature, so it pumps it through the cooling system and keeps it cold. And then there's your process pump that moves the glycol from the reservoir through the actual glycol system and then back. The glycol process piping carries the glycol solution to the jackets, from the reservoir through the process pump, through all the lines to the jackets that require them on the fermenters. So the glycol process pump pushes the glycol, like I said, through these jackets, through the return pipe, and brings that solution back to the reservoir that's housed by the unit itself. The process pump remains on all the time. It's always pumping. It's pushing glycol through the jackets or through a bypass valve back to the reservoir. So each drop from the process piping, so you have your header, your main inlet header, where the glycol is pumping through via the process pump, always. From each of these, there are tanks underneath them, or above them, wherever it's kind of situated. There is a drop. So from these process pipe, from the big sort of trunk, your big header, you'll have drops from the header that come from the header to the fermenter, that carry the glycol from the header to the fermenter. Usually each of these drops in the process piping will have a solenoid valve and or a manual ball valve installed. And the valves are opened and closed based on the temperature readings from each tank. So you'll have a thermal well that'll have a digital thermometer into it usually that'll then go to a control panel. And the control panel, you can set a temperature on it. If the temperature goes a little warm, the solenoid valve will open up, allowing the glycol to flow through, because the glycol is always flowing. The process pump's always going. When it's cool enough, or it's a little too cold, it'll kick off the solenoid valve. Glycol doesn't go to that tank. It just passes that tank now because it can't go through the solenoid valve that's closed. It goes past it, and then there's usually a bypass valve that allows the glycol to come through the header, back to the return loop, and then back to the glycol unit itself. So, fermentation monitoring. Breweries will often monitor these elements daily. This is all part of fermentation. This fermentation is much more than just temperature, but at the top of that list, temperature. Monitor temperature. You monitor pressure. You monitor gravity. You monitor your pH, cell count, viability, vitality, media and wort stability, so your plating media, or you're checking sort of wort stability tests, IBU, SRM, ABV, and VDK. So we're going to get into all of these and like what these mean. So when you're monitoring temperature, I realize I'm in the way on this one as well, so I'm going to read through these. During install, every fermenter can be equipped with a resistance temperature detector, or an RTD. I just kind of mentioned this, which that fits into the thermal well. An RTD displays the temperature digitally, either on a control panel or an individual display for that fermenter by itself. The control panel, or temp probe, can be changed manually for each individual tank. So you can change the temp probe or whatever you want it to be in the control panel for every one of the tanks by itself, where you want that temperature to be. When the RTD reads a temperature higher than the set degree, it will open a solenoid valve, allowing the glycol to flow through the tank jackets, cooling it down. When the RTD reads a temperature lower than the set degree, it closes the solenoid valve, stopping the glycol flow, keeping it from cooling down too far, allowing it to free rise back to where it's supposed to be, or to stay where it's supposed to be. So monitoring temperature also, most breweries have a desired fermentation temperature for each individual brand. So my Hefeweizen, for example, probably won't ferment the same as my Saison. Your temperatures won't. So you have a set degree, set temperature degree for each of these brands. A glycol system installed with solenoid valves, RTDs, and control panels allows the brewery to completely control the temperatures of every brand during fermentation. So to have one tank at 80 degrees, one tank at 50 degrees, one tank at 35 degrees, and this tank at 70 degrees. All because I have this fermentation temperature. I have an RTD, I have a control panel, I have solenoid valves, and I have a glycol system and a jacketed fermenters. And that allows me to control all that. When using, however, a single-walled fermenter, breweries will often use a standard analog temperature gauges to monitor the tank temperatures. So all you need is a quick analog deal. You don't probably need anything digital by any means for those. Pressure. All fermenters are rated for a certain operating pressure, and you'll usually get this from your manufacturer. It is very important to know what that is. Whatever it is, know what it is so that you're not, you don't overshoot your pressure, and so you know what sort of room you have to play with. The pressure of the fermenter is always often a good indicator also of where the beer is in process. For example, we'll dry hop and condition a beer. Every one of our beers we dry hop at 5 psi. So we'll set the tank to 5 psi in the fermenter. If the fermenter is at 5 psi, I know that it's not fermenting. For example, I might come in and my assistant brewer has dry hopped it and set it to 5 psi. I can look at the fermenter and I know right away this beer is almost finished just because I looked at the pressure. So this is an indication. This is fermentation monitoring. Just based on that simple process, I know 5 psi. We've crashed it. We dropped temp. We've dry hopped. We've let it sit for conditioning. All I need to do is look and see how long it's been conditioning or taste the beer to see where it needs to be next. All of the readings should also reflect this. So gravity readings, any sort of density levels, any of our sort of VDK, anything else we do should reflect that this beer is at this step in the process. Process, however, varies greatly brewery to brewery. My process is not the same as Cigar City, is not the same as $3, is not the same as anyone else's. And that's okay. That's not one's not better than the other. It's just every process is going to be different. So as you sort of work in breweries and you get to know some of this stuff, just know that every one of these processes are a little different, and so you just have to learn what the processes are in the place that you're working. So gravity. Gravity is the density level of liquid. That's in a nutshell. That's what gravity means. So a high gravity reflects a high sugar content. A low gravity reflects a low sugar content, at least for brewers, as far as we're concerned. Original gravity, or OG, is the sugar content at the beginning of fermentation. So before fermentation starts, right when we pitch the yeast, or right before we pitch the yeast, we take a gravity reading. That's our original gravity. That's our OG. Final gravity, FG, is the sugar content at the end of fermentation. We you can take these by using a hydrometer or a psychrometer or a spectrophotometer. Those are different items that you can use to test sort of gravity. And we actually monitor ours daily just to make sure that fermentation is healthy. This will let us know, for example, if we see a huge drop in gravity real fast, we know the yeast is really healthy and working, and then assume it just stops. And 3 days in a row, we have the exact same gravity. Clearly, there's something wrong with fermentation. That's what that means. The difference between your original gravity and your final gravity will give you what your ABV is. And so every beer is probably going to have in fermentation monitoring, like every brewer is going to know, this is where this beer starts, where its OG usually is, and then this is what this beer's final gravity is, what we're shooting for. So if that's wrong, that's like I mentioned in the last slide, the other numbers, your other readings should indicate where you are in this process, should help you know. So if you know that this beer is supposed to finish at 2.5 Plato and it's at 3.5, well, it's not finished yet. If it's at 1.5, it went a little too far. So these are all things that you use to sort of monitor to make sure all your fermentations are healthy and active and what they're supposed to be. pH is very important. So by using a pH meter, you can monitor the pH of every brand daily. That's what we do. Every single day, we take a pH. pH is a great way to monitor the consistency of each brand. You definitely want the pH to be very, very similar, if not always the same on each of these brands. That way they taste the same. Tracking how often the starting and final pH of a certain brand matches its previous batches is the way in which you can kind of see the consistency of your hot side, of how you're doing your kettle stuff, how you're coming out of your brew house, fermentation sort of health as far as the yeast. Drastic pH changes can indicate microbial infection and or poor yeast health. So if you have horrible yeast changes, you can have some bad yeast health, or for example, if your pH drops drastically, there's a possibility you might even have bacteria involved. So pH is an extremely important part test that you can very easily take. All right, so cell count, viability, and vitality. I'm in the way on some of this, so we'll read through these again. So cell count can be monitored with a hemocytometer and a microscope, so we use it at our place. Take a hemocytometer, we take samples every single day from every one of our tanks, and we look at every single beer under a microscope every single day to check the cell count and the viability. Viability can be monitored also with a hemocytometer or microscope and methylene blue stain. So the way this works is we'll take a sample, we'll dilute it to a specific number, and then we add methylene blue, let it sit for a minute. The methylene blue will react to dead yeast cells, and they'll show up on the hemocytometer, so we can then count the percentage of dead versus healthy cells, and that'll give us a percentage of how much healthy yeast we actually have. Vitality, and these others that I just mentioned, viability, and cell count, can all be monitored with a cellometer, which is a device you just kind of input a sample in, and it kind of shoots out all these items. Cell count at the beginning of fermentation usually has a target of 1 million cells per ml per degree Plato. However, the higher the gravity requires a higher cell count ratio. So usually this usually holds true in the industry standard across the board, usually upwards of 15 to 16 Plato. Once you get to about 15 Plato, usually you're going to want like 2 million cells per degree Plato per ml, just to make sure you have enough healthy yeast in order to get the job done. So viability at the beginning of fermentation tells you how much of that cell count is actually living. So you might be pitching 1 million cells per degree Plato per ml, but how much of it is actually alive? Assume it's 80%, well then is that really 1 million cells per degree Plato per ml? So the way we do it, for example, is we don't consider the dead cells when we're counting, when we're saying this is what we're going to pitch. So if we have a 96% viable strain, we only consider the 96% when we calculate our 1 million cells per ml per degree Plato. Viability, or usually the cell count is based on the viability, meaning that the dead cells are not considered in the initial cell count ratio, which is what I was just mentioning. Like, this is how we do it. We don't consider the dead ones in that sort of cell count. Vitality can actually tell you how healthy the living cells are, and this is only really done with a cellometer. There is a potential that you'll have some healthy cells and high viability, but a lot of them might not have a good vitality. All right, continuing on the cell count, viability, vitality. Yeast selection is dictated by monitoring yeast during fermentation. That's how we know which yeast we're going to select. That's how we know which yeast we're going to pitch next. Yeast that is either sluggish during fermentation or is rating extremely low in one or all three of these areas, we likely just dump it down the drain. And either another yeast performing at a higher rate or a new yeast that we order from a yeast lab will be chosen for future fermentation. So if it's showing some sluggish characteristics, we're not going to use it. We're going to dump it down the drain. Yeast selection is completely based off of which strain is proving to be the strongest one. In-house, if we have a yeast in our stout that's 98% and is killing it and it's really well, and then we have one in our IPA that's 75 and very slow, we're obviously not going to harvest 75. We're going to harvest the stout yeast strain. So that's the one we use. If they both are bad and they're both messing up, we order new yeast. All right, so medias and wort stability. So plating media allows the lab to monitor the microbial makeup of the product and surfaces. So we'll talk a little bit more of that, obviously, in Module 9. But the idea being that the lab can swap surfaces in the brewery, especially surfaces that beer touches, obviously, in process, and then it can also take like packaged product or product that's even in fermentation or pre-fermentation, and plate it on media, see what grows, see if there's a problem with any of that, see if there's any unwanted microorganisms alive and present. So wort stability allows the lab to monitor spoilage before and after an inoculation of the wort. So we do wort stability, for example, we'll take samples right out of the heat exchanger on the way to the fermenter, and then we'll also take some right in the fermenter after we pitch the yeast. And then what we're able to do is sort of see if the wort pre-fermentation or pre-inoculation of brewer's yeast ferments at all. So we know if there's a problem in the heat exchanger in the process and transferring, if it ferments, if there's something there, then that means that there's an issue on the cleaning side, which is something we need to know. As far as the fermentation, we need that to sort of ferment out normally, and if it does, then we have no problems because we'll take it after inoculation. IBU, SRM, ABV, and VDK. These are pretty important. So all these can be monitored for consistency with a UV visible spectrophotometer. VDK identification can assist also in the process. And UV visible spectrophotometer also tests things like hop acids, free amino nitrogen, iodine, sulfite, carbs, and polyphenols. You can get all this from a UV visible spectrophotometer. Fermentation control monitoring. The best fermentation control comes from understanding and applying daily monitoring procedures. So if you understand the procedures, if you understand what these things are, and I guess just to go back real quick, let's talk about a minute at least. VDK, for example, I guess I haven't qualified that. VDK is diacetyl, essentially, which is an off flavor that tastes like butter popcorn. Versatile decletones, which is what that stands for. And so if you have, for example, a UV visible spectrophotometer in your lab, that's awesome. You can test so many things, especially if you also have a salometer. It's very fast. You can go through all your tanks very quickly, and you have a good sort of hold, I guess you could say, on your monitoring. VDK, however, can be determined via sensory. We do it all the time where we'll take a sample out of a tank, we'll split it in half. Part of it will heat, part of it won't, and we have a very quick. It's very easier to identify diacetyl off flavors. The butter popcorn, kind of nasty, corny kind of characteristic from fermentation, just from the heated versus the non-heated. So again, the best way for fermentation control, the best thing you can do is to understand and then apply the daily monitoring procedures. So understanding them, having the equipment, running the test means absolutely nothing if there's no application. If you do find a problem, that doesn't mean there's a problem, no big deal. If there's a problem, fix it, find it, bring that beer back, care about it, and find out where the problem was, and then fix it. So that's what fermentation control is. It's not just about knowing it; it's about applying it. So that's it for this slide. I'll see you on the next one. Thanks, guys.